What I say to you in the dark, tell in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim from the housetops. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both body and soul. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs on your head are counted. So do not be afraid, you are of more value than many sparrows. Everyone therefore who acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. I think we could preach the entire summer on just this passage. It is so full of wonderful, wonderful messages of hope and courage and strength and perseverance that we so desperately need in our world right now. You notice that it didn't say, it says, and even the hairs of your head are all counted. I think Jesus was speaking with people that had hair on their heads at that time. So it's okay if some of us have less than others right now. The message still very much applies. I know some of you think I talk about myself too much. I know some of you think I don't talk about myself too much. But I want to share something that happened in our family this week with you as part of our message time this morning. A week ago, we had an opportunity to go away for a couple of days. And when we came back, I was doing the garden inspection. Do you ever do that? You just kind of walk around, you see what needs weeding, what's missing, what's not where it ought to be. And so I came home and I walked to the back garden and I discovered that one of my hosta plants that we had transplanted, which was doing just fine when I left, had been eaten. Instead of being about this big around, it had survived my transplanting skills, and yet it was now about this far from the ground. Just one particular one. The others were fine. It was just this one particular plant. And I thought, you know, for heaven's sakes, like, rabbits, you never bothered with it before. What have you done to it now? I can't say I was feeling particularly generous towards the rabbits in the neighborhood in that moment. I thought, well, if you're going to eat my plants, fine. I am not going to weed the garden today. I was protesting, so I went and I sat down, and I wasn't going to attempt to weed the garden if they were going to eat it, right? Like, they could just eat the weeds too while they were at it. And so instead I went and I sat down, and we have a 3-year-old black lab named Oliver, many of you know. I thought, no, we're going to throw Oliver's toy for him instead. Now Oliver, thanks to Maureen, who stopped by IKEA many months ago, Oliver has these little toy mice that are from IKEA. It's not a plug, we're not getting product placement. You see, I didn't bring the mice with me. He loves to play with them. He carries them around. They last for a few months. He eventually rips their little heads off, and then we start again. But they're really, really cute little mice. So anyhow, we're throwing Oliver's mouse for him. And so we threw it, and he chased, and he pounced, and it was wonderful, and it squeaked, and he brought it back to us. And we thought, great. Okay, I'm not weeding the garden. I'm going to play with Oliver. This is just what I need right now. Threw the mouse again. And he went and he fetched it and he jumped on it like he does, and it squeaked, and he brought it back to me, and it was just wonderful. I thought, this is so much better than weeding a garden, right? And then I realized that mouse doesn't squeak. It's just a stuffed mouse, right? Like, it doesn't have a squeaker inside of that mouse. And so we got up and I started to have a look around, and there's a big clump of grass. I was thinking of you this week when you were sharing with us at the choir dinner, because there's this big clump of grass, but it's like right in the middle of the backyard. And so I went and I moved this clump of grass because that's where the mouse is, and that's where we've been throwing it, and that's where the squeak's coming from. And so I moved aside the clump of grass, and, well, Kent. Okay, you've met Kent, right? And he knows I'm telling you this, but Kent's about 6'1", 6'2", and he's a fairly brave man, I think. Well, Kent stood over here, and the clump of grass was over there, and of course I'm down on my hands and knees, and I'm moving the clump of grass aside, and he's just standing back, right? We're all gifted in different ways. So anyhow, we uncovered this clump of grass, and we discovered that the bunnies have made themselves a little nest right in the middle of our backyard. Now, Oliver had only been gone for 3 days, so we knew that this had happened at some point during those 3 days. We knew that they had to be less than a week old. At first, we weren't sure what they were because they were so young. Their eyes were still shut and they were just kind of squirming about. But we've got at least 6 little rabbits in the middle of our yard. And so I wasn't thinking about the gardening anymore. All of a sudden, our attention shifted to these wonderful little rabbits that are helpless. And so we've made a little bit of a little mini rabbit sanctuary in our backyard. We moved the table over top. We moved the chairs all around. We blocked the 2 ends so that the rabbit, Mama Rabbit can still get in, but the dog can't get in. He can just peek his head over the top. And so for the last 8 days or so, we've just been watching. We haven't moved the grass again, as tempting as that has been to have a look at them. But at certain times, you can see this mound moving up and down. And it's like the earth is getting ready to give birth again. It's breathing. It's going up and down. And Oliver's been watching. I don't know if he remembers when he caught a little baby rabbit before and I got to chase him around the yard and retrieve it from him. He didn't hurt it. I don't know if he remembers it, but I remember it. And so I'm trying to avoid that experience and give these little rabbits just a little bit of a boost until they can get out and get on their own and find safer territory in my gardens where there are no more hosta plants because that one's been eaten. But I share this with you because I thought, it's funny because we can be busy grumping about something and we hit those moments where we just want to sit down and protest, right? Like we've had enough. We just want to sit down and protest. And even then, God still has this ability and the willingness to give us a tap on the shoulder and say, I'm not quite done with you yet. I'm not quite done with you. There's something that needs you. And it's as if God says, I'm not done with you yet because I need you to do the work of Jesus Christ in this world. This whole situation with the rabbit and the plant has been going on, and I've been pondering it and the Bible passage from the lectionary this week. And as I've been trying to help care for these rabbits and I've been pondering our passage about sparrows and everything this week, I've heard the news of the world, which, no surprise to you, it doesn't sound that great out there what we hear broadcast on the news. You have to turn that dial an awful lot of times or turn your station an awful lot of times to find some good news being shared with us. Today's reading that Eugene shared with us is just a small part of the much wider story in which Jesus is sharing wisdom and instructions. And he's sharing these with his disciples, and he's well aware of the challenges that he has faced when trying to share God's message, and he knows that there's challenges that are going to be faced by other people who are going to do the same. It's not news to Jesus or to his disciples or to any of us today that there is opposition and challenges to be met when we're saying or acting in a way that is different from some of the people around us. What's different, however, is how Jesus responds and teaches them how to respond to those challenges. If you take the time to go back a little bit farther in chapter 10, perhaps later today, you'll find Jesus sharing a few key pointers, giving his followers and giving his friends some traveling instructions as they move forward through their own lives. He acknowledges their hearts' hesitations. He doesn't shy away from addressing their concerns when he speaks. Cole's note version here, when you go back, you can see if I'm right, but I think I am on this one. Condensed version, I know Matthew takes a lot more words to say it, and I know Jesus takes a lot more words to say it, but basically when you read those traveling instructions for his companions, what he says is stick together. You don't have to go it alone. Through life, through challenges, through it all, God did not intend you to go through any of it alone. The second thing he says is preach God's message of love. Absolutely, yes. Preach the message of God. But don't stop there, because the message is received and understood when people experience the message for themselves. Don't just preach to people that God loves them, show them how God loves them. Healing and hope come through actions. The third thing Jesus says is travel light. You've heard me and other people say this before. You travel light. You don't need all that excess baggage that you might be carrying with you that you've gathered up over the last 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 years. You don't need to take any of that baggage with you. Travel light. Travel on and trust that you have everything and you will have everything that you need. Don't let your baggage prevent you from sharing God's message with other people. And the fourth thing that Jesus says is be prepared. It's a new message that you might be bringing to other people. It's a new message that you might be allowing into your own heart. It's a new way of life that you're called on to demonstrate to the world. Not everyone's going to like what you have to say, and that's okay. Be prepared. It's going to happen, and when it does, remember that God works in many ways through many different people. There is no one right way to experience or to live out the message of God. When it happens, when people protest, when people disagree, that's okay. Remember, God works in different ways. Dust off your feet and move on and trust that God is still going to be there long after you have left. God will still leave an imprint in people's lives. I think this last message of Jesus in his traveling instructions is where much of the discourse between people and religions begins to fester like an open wound that's been left untreated. We think that we have interpreted things in the right way and in the only way. We read the holy words and we hear them interpreted and we hear them preached on by someone else, and we experience God in this way or in that way or in another way. And based on our knowledge, our beliefs, our understandings, we do certain things. And that can lead to wonderful things. It can lead to absolutely wonderful things sometimes, but sometimes not so much. Sometimes we get so focused on our own way of thinking or interpreting or believing that we forget about the diversity of the world that we live in. We forget about the diversity that God has created among all living creatures, including ourselves. We forget that our way of doing things is not necessarily always God's way of doing things. And we get so focused on us that we forget to check in with the Holy One and make sure that we're still on track. The trouble back when Jesus was speaking to his followers was that people had a tendency to stay behind close, safe, secure doors, to whisper about things, to keep long-held truths to themselves. They were afraid of what might happen if word got out and spread too far. The religious authorities of the time were well aware that so long as they kept to themselves and they kept their followers in line, that they would pretty much be left alone by the Roman authorities. They could continue doing what they were doing as long as they didn't disrupt anybody else's world. They didn't go looking for trouble. They kept the peace as much as possible. They certainly didn't invite the attention of the Roman authorities. And so when Jesus comes along and he starts encouraging people to start speaking in the light, he encourages people to come out from behind those closed doors and speak about what they believe and what they've experienced and what they've witnessed of God's love. Not in the privacy of the synagogue, not just at the private dining tables, but everywhere with anyone, regardless of their status in society, regardless of where they come from. It's a problem. Not only is Jesus a troublemaker, but he's encouraging other people to be troublemakers too. Back then, or now, religious authorities might be acting from a position of wanting to keep their people safe and secure, wanting to ensure that certain long-held beliefs and traditions continue. But in doing so, that becomes part of a much, much bigger problem. And we are living with some of those problems in our world today. They're not new problems, but some of them are generated from staying behind those closed doors. Because when we spend all of our time talking about things in the dark, as Jesus puts it, and we don't spend any time talking about them in the light, we don't get a chance to practice talking about what we believe, or why we believe it. When we do take the opportunity to speak about things in the light, what happens is that we don't have enough practice and experience to go on, and so we don't go about things in the right way. And I don't just mean us. I mean faith groups around the world that have kept things in the dark for so long that now that there's an opportunity to start dialoguing and talking about them in the light of day, we simply don't know how to do it well yet. When we spend those months and years and decades learning and interpreting and sharing just with people that we know, just within the boundaries of the church or the synagogue or the mosque or any other place that we might gather, when we only speak to people who are like-minded about what we believe, what happens is not only are our own beliefs reinforced, but we build those walls that we've talked about before. We build those walls thicker and higher. We build them higher, and we might not even know that they're being built until the time comes when someone or something happens and there's a crack in the wall, or we decide that, you know, we've finally mustered up the courage and the strength to move beyond those walls and to speak to other people. When we emerge from the darkness and we think, oh, we've got all the answers, right? Like, we've been talking about this stuff for years. We have all the answers. We've got it figured out. When we do that, we've got our ears closed to anything that anyone else might say. And that's when people get hurt and the insults start to fly and the bricks get tossed and toes get stepped on. And in many times what happens is chaos results on a small scale between individuals and on a much larger scale, like we're starting to see happen in various places in the world. The walls get reinforced and made stronger in some cases instead of being taken down. Now, I'm not telling you anything new. Like, you already know this. You've already experienced this. We hear about the instability in countries all around the world. People are so convinced that their way, one way, is the right way, that their ears are closed to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there might be just a little bit of truth in what the other person or the other party has to say. We're not always the greatest at listening to the truth, especially when it's hard to hear. We dig in our heels or we sit down in protest. We just don't want to hear what we don't want to hear sometimes. We have a tendency to try to shout louder or longer than the other person. We think that somehow if we do that, it's going to somehow effectively communicate what we're trying to say, and we're going to convince that other person. But Jesus knew that very rarely does that work well. When you yell louder and longer than another person, there's no communication taking place. You can't hear what the other person has to say. And Jesus knew this. There will be people who don't want to hear what you have to say. Be prepared, Jesus teaches us. And remember, you are the messenger. You're not the message. And sometimes we forget that. We're the messengers. We are not the message. Dust off your feet, Jesus says. You can't do this if you're sitting still. I challenge you right now to try to figure out how you might dust off your feet without bending over or without picking up your feet. How would you dust off your feet? If you shake them, you have to move them, right? Awesome. Okay. You have to move your body in order to dust off your feet. And that's what Jesus says, dust off your feet. You can't dust off your feet if you're sitting still and you're digging in your heels. You have to move your body. You have to get going. You can't stay stuck in one position. It's not going to work. Get moving. God is with you, Jesus says. That's what Jesus teaches us. That's what we hear through the scriptures. Don't dig in your heels. Don't sit down and protest. Get up. Dust off your feet if you need to. Know that God is still going to be there. Know that God is still working through people. And we hear all that. And some of us have heard it many, many times throughout our lives. But the reality is that even when we've heard that message many times, that there are still instances where we run into an individual or a situation or a belief that just doesn't seem right to us. And then we seem to forget about what Jesus has taught us. And we plant our feet firmly, and we dig in our heels, or we sit down and we hold on to those armrests, and we plant ourselves, right? There is no way on God's green earth that we are ever going to bend over and dust off our feet like Jesus says, because if you bend over and you try to dust off your feet, okay, if I can't get back up, nobody laugh. If you bend over and you dust off your feet, right, what does it do? It exposes the back of your head. It exposes your neck. You might get decapitated. You might get knocked over. There's no way we're going to dust off our feet. And even if you think, okay, I'm going to play it safe, I'm going to lift up one foot and I'm just going to shake, right? I'm going to kind of do what Jesus says. I'm going to just lift up one foot and then I'll lift up the other one. The problem with that is that, you know what? You're still not as stable as when you have 2 feet firmly planted on the ground, right? And that's the human part of us, and God knows that. We hear this message, Jesus says, dust off your feet, and we say, yeah, but you know what? If I'm firmly planted, I'm safe. I can take care of myself. No one's going to push me over. No one's going to knock me over. I know the right way. And this is my position, and I'm sticking with it. Maybe you've found yourself wondering, why on earth would Jesus ever suggest such a thing? Encouraging us to speak about God, to speak about what we have witnessed and experienced in our lives. And then to say, do that, but get ready to move on. Isn't he contradicting himself? Did Matthew somehow get it wrong by including this in the gospel? Did Matthew get it wrong? I don't know about you, but I think Matthew got it absolutely right. Because I firmly believe it is not up to us to convince or convert or convict anyone who has beliefs or ideologies that are different than ours. It's not up to us. We're not God. We're the believers. We're the followers. We're the workers. We're like those sparrows that are spoken of in the Gospel of Matthew. Sparrows who are part of a much, much bigger universe filled with birds and creatures and all sorts of wonderful things that come in all sorts of different sizes and substances. And God is so much bigger than any one of us or even all of us put together. And I think we forget that. I think we forget that we are like those sparrows that Jesus also speaks about. That we forget that God is so much bigger than any of us. I don't think that that's just comforting news for you on a Sunday morning to hear that God is so much bigger than any of us. I think that that's empowering news. I think that that's news that if you grasp hold of that, you realize frees you up to draw on a much greater power source than any of us have or any of us will ever have within one individual person. I think it's news that frees us up to live and to act and to speak with compassion and courage, knowing that it's not all up to us. We don't hold the fate of this church in our hand. We don't hold the fate of this community or this nation in our hands. We're the sparrows. We're called on to listen and interpret and act out of what God has given to us. God holds us in the palm of his hand and simply asks that we do our part. And I think as a faith community, if I'm not mistaken, I think we're not doing too bad at listening to God when God speaks to us. I think we're doing our part. We don't always get it right, but there's good news in that too, because God is a forgiving God. We're the messengers. We're the sparrows that are given the task to demonstrate God's love through our word and our actions, through our everyday lives. Now, some of you know an awful lot about sparrows. You know that they don't live alone. You know that they have a song in their voice. You know that they call out for other little sparrows to join them. They have the ability to make their voice heard in a way that is invitational to other birds. Sparrows aren't generally very boisterous. They're certainly not the most flashy ones you're going to see in the backyard or in the community gardens on any given day. But sparrows do eat their share of bugs, right? They're doing their part. They're eating their bugs. They're helping to clean up the earth a little bit. Sparrows endure cold winters and rainy springs and every kind of weather in between. Sparrows cooperate through the sharing of resources, through reliance on the Creator. It's possible for sparrows to make it through those long, cold winters. The sparrows trust that everything that they need will somehow be provided. They care for each other, and they rely on each other, and they rely on the care and the compassion of our Creator. When you go back and you read over this passage, which I surely hope that you will, if not today, then in one day in the very near future, what I'd like you to remember is that God holds us in the palm of His hand. God shelters us and brings us through those storms in life. God brings us together in community, and God sets us free in order to serve and love other people and help Christ heal the wounds in this world. I think that the world needs all kinds of creatures and birds. The world needs all kinds of people who represent God in many different forms. May we remember that around the world and in this community, our ways do not always line up with God's ways. But may we also remember the sparrow and have the courage to trust that even when we make mistakes, even when we make those missteps, even when we hurt others or ourselves through our actions, even then we are promised through Scripture that God cares for us and holds us in the palm of His hand. God cares for us and invites us to seek forgiveness and to try again. May we have the willingness to listen closely to the whispers and the shouts that God speaks of. May we have the willingness to hear God's story of never-ending care and mercy and compassion for all people. Amen.